Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected ways. In a world where people are quick to judge by appearances, true worth often goes unnoticed until someone takes the time to look deeper. Ruby Langston, a wealthy widow in Deadman's Gulch, offers her hand in marriage to any man who can tame a wild horse. 50 men try and fail. Then a poor cowboy with nothing but a worn saddle steps forward. The whole town laughs at him, but Ruby sees something different. What does this humble man possess that 50 stronger, richer men do not? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Langston estate, stretching from the main house down to the corrals where Ruby stood with her coffee, watching the ranch hands begin their daily work. At 47, she possessed the kind of beauty that came from character rather than youth-auburn hair streaked with silver that she refused to dye, green eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow, and hands that bore the calluses of honest work despite her wealth. The estate sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, a testament to her late husband's vision and ruthless business acumen. Marcus Langston had built his fortune laying railroad track across the territory, accumulating land grants and mineral rights until he owned more of this corner of the world than any man had a right to. When consumption took him 3 years ago, he left Ruby everything: the ranch, the mines, the railroad shares, and the burden of managing it all alone. Ruby twisted the simple gold band on her finger, a habit she'd developed since Marcus's passing. Unlike the gaudy jewelry he'd showered her with during their marriage, this ring had been his first gift to her, bought with his last silver dollar when he was nothing but a track layer with big dreams. She kept it on her right hand now, a reminder of the man she'd loved before wealth changed him, before success built walls around his heart. "Morning, Mrs. Langston," called Tom Fletcher, her foreman, as he approached with his characteristic limp from an old injury. Tom had worked for Marcus since the early days and stayed on after his death, one of the few men Ruby trusted completely. "Tom," she nodded, appreciating his steady presence. "How are the new colts looking?" "Coming along fine. That paint mare's foal should make a fine cutting horse in a few years." He paused, studying her face with the familiarity of someone who'd known her for over a decade. "You sleep at all last night?" Ruby's laugh held no humor. "About as well as usual." The truth was, the big house felt empty despite its 8 bedrooms and grand parlors. She'd taken to sleeping in the smaller guest room rather than the master suite she'd shared with Marcus, but even there, silence pressed against her like a physical weight. The town of Deadman's Gulch sat 3 miles down the valley, a collection of weathered buildings that had grown up around the railroad depot Marcus had convinced the company to build. What started as a water stop had become a proper town with a mercantile, a church, a school, and the Silver Dollar Saloon, where most of the territory's business was conducted over whiskey and cards. Ruby made her way there most afternoons, not out of any particular need, but because the house grew too quiet and her own thoughts too loud. The townspeople treated her with a mixture of respect and wariness, respect for her wealth and position, wariness because she'd never quite fit their expectations of how a proper widow should behave. She ran her own affairs, made her own decisions, and didn't defer to the men who thought her fortune made her their concern. "Afternoon, Ruby," Martha Henderson called from behind the mercantile counter as Ruby entered to collect supplies. Martha was one of the few women in town who dared use Ruby's first name, a privilege earned through years of straight talk and genuine friendship. "Martha," Ruby set her basket on the counter. "How's business?" "Can't complain, though I hear tell there's been some excitement out at your place." Martha's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "Something about a horse causing trouble." Ruby sighed. The story would be all over town by now anyway. A stallion broke through the fence 2 nights ago, black as midnight and meaner than sin. Scattered my breeding stock and injured 2 of my best mares before Tom and the boys could drive him into the empty corral. "Wild one, is he?" "Wild doesn't begin to describe him. Tom says he's never seen anything like it. Part Mustang, part something bigger. Probably escaped from someone's ranch, but nobody's come looking for him yet. Ruby selected flour and coffee from Martha's shelves. The boys are calling him Diablo, and it fits. Every time someone gets near that corral, he goes into a fury. Martha shook her head, shamed to have such a fine animal going to waste. Marcus always said a good horse was worth its weight in silver. The mention of her husband brought the familiar ache to Ruby's chest. Marcus had loved horses almost as much as he'd loved making money, and he'd known how to handle both. He did say that, she agreed quietly. You thought about what to do with him? Ruby had thought about little else. The stallion was magnificent despite his fury, probably 16 hands high, with the kind of conformation that spoke of speed and endurance. In the right hands, he could sire a line of horses that would be the envy of every rancher in the territory. But those hands would have to be exceptional. I suppose I'll have to find someone to break him, Ruby said, though the prospect filled her with dread. She'd seen too many horses broken in the traditional sense there, spirit crushed along with their wildness until they became hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves. Won't be easy finding someone willing to take on a horse like that, Martha observed. Especially not around here. Most of the boys who think they're horsemen are better at talking than riding. Ruby had been thinking the same thing. The local ranch hands were competent enough with gentle stock, but Diablo was something else entirely. She'd need someone with real skill, real experience with difficult horses. The problem was, men with that kind of expertise usually came with egos to match, and Ruby had grown tired of dealing with men who thought her wealth made her their prize to be won. As she made her way to the Silver Dollar for her usual afternoon coffee, Ruby found herself the center of attention in a way that made her uncomfortable. Word of the stallion had indeed spread, and every man in the saloon seemed to have an opinion about what she should do with him. "Ruby, darling," called out Jake Morrison, a cattle buyer from Denver who'd been sniffing around her property for months. "I hear you've got yourself a problem horse. You know, I've broken plenty of broncs in my time. Be happy to take a look at him for you." Ruby accepted a cup of coffee from the bartender and chose a table near the window, hoping to avoid the conversation she could feel building. But Jake wasn't the type to take a hint, and within minutes she was surrounded by would-be suitors offering their services. "Now, Mrs. Langston," said Frank Hutchins, a rancher from the next county over, "what you need is someone with experience. I've been working horses since before you were born, and I can tell you that Stallion just needs a firm hand." "Firm hand, hell," laughed Pete Carlson, whose ranch bordered Ruby's to the south. "Horse like that needs to know who's boss. Few days without food and water, then a good beating with a quirt that'll settle him down real quick." Ruby's jaw tightened. The casual cruelty in Pete's voice reminded her why she preferred the company of her horses to most men. "I won't have any animal on my property mistreated, Pete. You'd do well to remember that." The conversation continued around her, each man trying to outdo the others with tales of their horsemanship and not-so-subtle hints about their availability as a husband. Ruby listened with growing frustration, realizing that not one of them cared about the horse's welfare. They saw only an opportunity to prove themselves and win her favor. As the afternoon wore on and the whiskey flowed more freely, the boasting grew louder and more ridiculous. Ruby found herself thinking about Marcus and how he would have handled this situation. Her husband had been many things ruthless in business, demanding of his employees, sometimes cold in his personal relationships, but he'd understood horses. He would have seen Diablo's potential and found a way to unlock it without breaking the animal's spirit. The thought crystallized into an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Ruby stood up, and the room gradually quieted as the men sensed she was about to speak. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the saloon, "I appreciate your offers of help, but I've decided to handle this matter in my own way." She paused, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. What she was about to propose would either solve her problem or make it infinitely worse, but she was tired of being seen as a prize to be won rather than a woman to be respected. "I'll make an offer," she continued, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "The man who can break Diablo really break him, not just beat him into submission that man can marry me. The silence that followed was so complete that Ruby could hear her own heartbeat. Then the room erupted into chaos as every man began talking at once, some laughing, others shouting questions, and a few looking at her as if she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had, but as Ruby walked out of the saloon and headed home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years' anticipation. Whatever happened next, it would certainly be interesting. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Ruby reached her ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with this land in the first place. Tomorrow, she knew, her life would change in ways she couldn't predict. The challenge she'd issued would bring men from across the territory, each hoping to claim both her and her fortune. But as she stood by the corral where Diablo paced restlessly in the gathering dusk, she found herself hoping that somewhere among them might be a man who understood that some things, horses, women, and hearts couldn't be broken, only earned. Word of Ruby's declaration spread across the territory like wildfire. By the next morning, riders were already arriving at the Langston Ranch, their horses lathered from hard travel and their eyes bright with ambition. Ruby watched from her kitchen window as Tom Fletcher directed the growing crowd of men toward the makeshift camp that had sprung up near the bunkhouse. "You sure about this, Ruby?" Tom asked as he came in for coffee, his weathered face creased with concern. "Some of these fellas rode all night to get here. Word is there's more coming from as far as Colorado." Ruby poured herself a cup and settled at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Marcus had shared their morning meals for 15 years. "I'm sure, Tom. Maybe for the first time in a long while, I'm completely sure about something." Through the window, she could see the men examining Diablo from a safe distance. The stallion stood in the center of the corral, his black coat gleaming in the morning sun, ears pinned back and nostrils flaring at the scent of so many strangers. Even from here, Ruby could feel the raw power radiating from the animal's 17 hands of pure defiance, wrapped in muscle and fury. The first official attempt came from Jake Morrison, the cattle buyer who'd been so confident the day before. Ruby positioned herself on the corral fence alongside 20 other spectators, some of whom had placed bets on the outcome. Jake strutted into the corral with a rope and bridle, his chest puffed out like a rooster's. Diablo watched him approach with the stillness of a coiled spring. For a moment, Ruby allowed herself to hope that maybe this would be simple, that Jake's confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. Then the stallion exploded into motion. What followed was less a horse-breaking attempt than a demonstration of physics. Diablo launched himself sideways, caught Jake's rope in his teeth, and proceeded to drag the man around the corral like a child's toy. Jake's confident shouts quickly turned to panicked curses, then to pleading as he found himself airborne more often than not. The crowd's cheers turned nervous, then worried, then silent, as it became clear that Jake was no longer in control of the situation. Tom vaulted over the fence and managed to distract Diablo long enough for Jake to scramble to safety, his fancy clothes torn and his pride in tatters. The cattle buyer limped away without a word, his face red with embarrassment. "Next," Ruby called out, though her voice carried less enthusiasm than before. She fingered the broken bridle that Jake had dropped in his hasty retreat, Diablo's first trophy. Frank Hutchins tried a different approach, entering the corral with grain and soft words, attempting to lure the stallion closer before making his move. Diablo played along for exactly 30 seconds, then struck out with his front hooves, barely missing Frank's head and sending the older man diving for the fence rails. Pete Carlson lasted the longest of the first day's attempts, mainly because he stayed mounted on his own horse and tried to rope Diablo from a distance. The stallion tolerated this for about 10 minutes before demonstrating that he could clear a 6-foot fence from a standing start. The crowd scattered as 1,500 pounds of furious horseflesh landed among them, and it took 6 men with ropes to drive Diablo back into the corral. As the sun set on the first day, Ruby stood alone by the corral, studying the horse that had just humiliated some of the territory's most experienced horsemen. Far from being exhausted by the encounters, Diablo seemed energized, pacing the fence line with his head high and his eyes bright with intelligence. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she murmured to the stallion, "making fools of all those men who think they can master you with ropes and rough handling." Diablo's ears swiveled toward her voice, and for a moment his pacing stopped. Ruby had the strangest feeling that he was studying her as intently as she was studying him, taking her measure just as she was taking his. The second day brought fresh challenges and more spectacular failures. A bronc rider from Wyoming lasted 47 seconds. Ruby timed it before Diablo deposited him in the water trough. A cavalry sergeant on leave from Fort Collins managed to get a rope around the stallion's neck, but found himself being towed around the corral at a gallop until he had the sense to let go. By the third day, a carnival atmosphere had developed around the ranch. Vendors had set up stands selling food and drink, and someone had organized a betting pool with increasingly creative odds. Ruby found herself both fascinated and disturbed by the spectacle her challenge had created. "Ruby, honey," Martha Henderson approached her during a lull between attempts. "You might want to reconsider this whole business. Some of these men are getting desperate, and desperate men do stupid things." As if summoned by Martha's words, a mountain of a man named Bronson Bull stepped into the corral. He stood well over 6 feet and carried a bullwhip, in addition to the usual rope and bridle. The crowd fell silent as he cracked the whip experimentally, the sharp sound making several horses in nearby corrals shy nervously. "Now you listen here, devil horse," Bronson bellowed, his voice carrying across the ranch. "I've broken mustangs from here to California, and I ain't about to let some overgrown pony make a fool of me." Ruby's stomach clenched as she watched Bronson approach Diablo, with the arrogance of a man who believed strength was the answer to every problem. The stallion stood perfectly still, but Ruby could see the tension coiling in his powerful hindquarters. The confrontation was brief but violent. Bronson managed to crack his whip twice before Diablo charged, his hooves striking sparks from the ground. The big man tried to stand his ground, which proved to be a mistake. Diablo reared up and came down with his front hooves just inches from Bronson's head, the impact driving the man to his knees. "Get him out of there," Ruby shouted, but Tom was already moving. This time it took 4 men to distract Diablo long enough for Bronson to escape, and even then the stallion pursued them halfway to the fence before wheeling away with what Ruby could only describe as contempt. That evening, as Ruby sat on her porch nursing a whiskey and watching the latest group of would-be suitors make their plans around their campfires, she began to question the wisdom of her challenge. 19 men had tried to break Diablo, and 19 had failed. Some had been merely embarrassed, others genuinely hurt, and she was beginning to fear that someone might be seriously injured or killed. Having second thoughts, Tom joined her on the porch, his own glass in hand. "Third and fourth thoughts," Ruby admitted. "I never imagined it would turn into this circus, and these men, they're not seeing Diablo as a horse that needs understanding. They're seeing him as an obstacle to overcome, a problem to solve with force. Horse like that, maybe force is all he understands." Ruby shook her head. "I don't believe that. Look at how he fights. It's not random or mindless. He's thinking, adapting to each new challenge. There's intelligence there, and intelligence can be reached." Over the following days, the attempts continued with predictable results. A rodeo champion from Texas managed to stay on Diablo's back for nearly 2 minutes before being launched into the corral fence. A wealthy rancher's son from Denver brought an expensive, silver-studded saddle and ended up watching Diablo trample it into scrap leather and twisted metal. By the end of the second week, 37 men had tried and failed. The betting pool had grown to include wagers on how long each challenger would last, whether they'd end up in the water trough or the fence rails, and how many pieces their equipment would be in afterward. Ruby found the whole spectacle increasingly distasteful. The problem was that her challenge had attracted exactly the wrong type of man. These were people who saw her wealth as a prize to be won, who viewed Diablo as merely an obstacle in their path to riches. Not one of them had spent time trying to understand the horse, to find the key to his cooperation rather than his submission. On the morning that marked 3 weeks since her announcement, Ruby stood by the corral before dawn, watching Diablo graze peacefully in the grey light. In moments like this, when no crowds pressed against the fence and no eager challengers invaded his space, the stallion seemed almost gentle. His movements held a fluid grace that spoke of perfect physical conditioning, and his alertness suggested a mind that was constantly processing information about his environment. "You're not really wild, are you?" Ruby said softly. "Someone trained you once, someone you trusted. What happened to make you so afraid of human touch?" Diablo's head came up at the sound of her voice, and for a moment their eyes met across the morning stillness. Ruby felt a jolt of recognition, as if she were looking at a kindred spirit, another soul that had been betrayed by trust and now held the world at bay through sheer force of will. The moment was broken by the arrival of challengers 38 through 45, a group of cowboys from a cattle drive who'd heard about the challenge and decided to try their luck. Ruby watched with growing resignation as each man approached Diablo with the same aggressive confidence, the same assumption that breaking a horse was simply a matter of superior strength and determination. The results were depressingly familiar. Diablo dispatched all 8 men with what was beginning to look like bored efficiency, his techniques now refined by practice. He'd learned that some men could be discouraged with a simple display of aggression, while others required more dramatic demonstrations of his capabilities. By the time challenger number 50 had been deposited ignominiously in the water trough, Ruby had made a decision. That evening, as the latest group of defeated suitors packed their belongings and nursed their wounded pride, she called Tom aside. "After tomorrow, no more," she said firmly. "If challenger 50, one can't succeed, I'm calling off this whole business." Tom nodded, relief evident in his weathered features. "Probably for the best, Ruby. That horse has made his point, and these men are starting to talk about bringing in professional bronc busters with whips and spurs. That won't end well for anyone." Ruby looked out toward the corral where Diablo stood silhouetted against the setting sun, his head high and his posture alert despite the day's confrontations. She'd started this challenge hoping to find a man who could see past her wealth to the woman beneath, someone who understood that lasting partnerships were built on respect rather than domination. Instead, she'd created a spectacle that revealed the worst aspects of masculine pride and greed. Tomorrow would bring the final attempt, and then she would have to face the possibility that her unconventional solution had solved nothing at all. The broken bridles, trampled saddles, and defeated challengers represented more than just failed horse-breaking attempts. They were symbols of her own failed hope, that somewhere in the world was a man who understood that some things couldn't be taken by force, only offered freely and received with gratitude. As she prepared for bed that night, Ruby found herself hoping that Challenger 51 would be different from all the others. But after 3 weeks of watching good men reduced to embarrassed failures and proud men humbled by a horse who refused to be conquered, her optimism had worn thin. Tomorrow would likely bring another defeat, another broken bridle to add to the growing collection, and then she would have to decide what to do with the magnificent, untamable stallion who had become both the symbol of her hopes and the instrument of their destruction. The morning air carried a hint of autumn when Eli Boone rode into the Langston Ranch on a bay mare that had seen better years. Ruby watched from her kitchen window as he dismounted near the barn, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had learned to compensate for old injuries. Even from a distance, she could see the pronounced limp in his left leg as he led his horse toward the water trough. He was unremarkable at first, glance medium height, lean build, clothes that were clean but patched in several places. His hat had been shaped by weather rather than fashion, and his boots bore the kind of honest wear that came from years in the saddle rather than hours in front of a mirror. But there was something in the way he moved, a quiet confidence that spoke of competence earned through experience rather than proclaimed through boasting. Tom Fletcher approached the newcomer with the wary politeness he'd developed over the past 3 weeks of managing Ruby's challenge. Ruby watched through the window as the two men spoke, noting how Eli listened more than he talked, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. His attention seemed focused on Tom rather than on the crowd of spectators or the famous stallion that had drawn him here. "Ma'am?" Maria Santos, Ruby's housekeeper, appeared at her elbow. "That new man is asking to speak with you." Tom brought him to the back door. Ruby found Eli Boone standing on her back porch, hat in hand, his mare's reins looped loosely around his wrist. Up close, she could see that he was older than she'd initially thought, probably in his late 40s, with grey threading through brown hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. His hands were scarred and calloused, but his nails were clean, and his clothes, though worn, were well maintained. "Mrs. Langston," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested either dust or old injury. "I'm Eli Boone. I understand you have a horse that needs working with." The phrase caught Ruby's attention immediately. Not breaking or taming or any of the dozen other terms the previous challengers had used, but working with. It suggested partnership rather than domination. "I do," she replied carefully, "though I should warn you that 50 other men have tried their hand with Diablo, and 50 have failed. Some were injured in the process." Eli nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the corral where Diablo stood, watching their conversation with alert interest. Tom mentioned that. Also mentioned that most of them went in thinking they could master the animal through force. "And you think differently?" "I think," Eli said, settling his weight more comfortably and clearly preparing for a longer conversation, "that any creature that smart and that strong doesn't get broken, it gets partnered with. Mind if I ask about his history?" Ruby found herself intrigued by the question. None of the other challengers had shown any interest in Diablo's background, focusing instead on their own credentials and experience. "He appeared on my land about a month ago, broke through fencing, and scattered my breeding stock before we could contain him. No one's claimed him, and I haven't been able to find anyone who recognizes his description." "Branded?" "No visible marks. Tom thinks he's part Mustang, part something bigger, probably thoroughbred or quarter-horse bloodlines." Eli studied the stallion with the intensity of a man reading a complicated text. Beautiful animal, strong hindquarters, good bone structure, alert carriage. Someone spent time with him once, that's not wild posture. Ruby felt a flutter of interest that had nothing to do with her challenge. Here, finally, was someone who looked at Diablo and saw the horse rather than the obstacle. "What makes you say that?" "Way he holds his head, how he positions himself. Wild horses don't stand like that. They're either defensive or ready to run. He's alert but not afraid, which means he's had positive human contact at some point." Eli paused, his weathered face thoughtful. "Question is, what happened to break that trust?" The insight struck Ruby as remarkably perceptive. She'd been watching Diablo for weeks and had sensed something similar, but hadn't been able to articulate it as clearly. "And you think you can rebuild that trust?" "Don't know," Eli admitted with refreshing honesty. "Won't know until I spend some time with him, but I'd like permission to try." There was something appealing about his straightforward approach, so different from the swagger and guarantees of the previous challengers. Ruby found herself studying Eli Boone with the same attention he'd given to Diablo, trying to read the story written in his scars and weathered features. "Where are you from, Mr. Boone?" "Most recently, Colorado. Before that, various places. I tend to follow work where I can find it." It wasn't much of an answer, but Ruby sensed that pushing for more information would be counterproductive. Men like Eli Boone, if she was reading him correctly, shared their histories when they chose to, not when pressed. "What kind of work?" "Ranch hand, mostly. Some training work with difficult horses." He shifted slightly, favoring his injured leg. "Not as much riding as I used to do, but I can still handle most situations that come up." Ruby made a decision that surprised her. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Boone? It's been a long morning, and I suspect we both have questions." 20 minutes later, they sat at her kitchen table with steaming mugs between them, the morning sun slanting through windows that looked out toward the corral, where Diablo continued his restless pacing. Ruby found herself more relaxed than she'd been in weeks, perhaps because Eli showed no signs of trying to impress her with grand gestures or elaborate promises. "Tell me about your approach," she said. "How would you work with a horse like Diablo?" Eli considered the question while sipping his coffee, clearly organizing his thoughts before speaking. First thing would be to spend time near him without making any demands. Let him get used to my presence, my scent, the sound of my voice. Some horses have been hurt by rushing, and they need to learn that patience exists. How long would that take? However long it takes. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on what he's been through and how deep the mistrust goes. Ruby thought about the previous challengers, most of whom had entered Diablo's corral within minutes of their arrival, convinced that immediate action was the key to success. The other men seemed to think speed was important. Speed's important when you're trying to prove something to an audience, Eli observed. Less important when you're trying to build a relationship with an animal that's been betrayed before. The comment carried weight beyond its obvious meaning, and Ruby found herself wondering about Eli Boone's own experiences with betrayal and trust. There was something in his manner that suggested familiarity with both. "You sound like you speak from experience." "Some." Eli set down his mug and looked directly at her for the first time since they'd sat down. His eyes were brown with flecks of gold, and they held the kind of steady patience she'd seen in her best horses. "Mrs. Langston, can I ask you something?" Ruby nodded, curious about what question he might have for her. "This challenge you've issued, is it really about the horse?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. For a moment, she considered deflecting with a light answer, but something in Eli's manner suggested he would see through any attempt at evasion. "Partly," she said finally. "Diablo needs someone who can work with him, and I need to know he'll be treated well. But you're right, there's more to it than that." Eli waited without pushing, demonstrating the same patience he'd described for working with difficult horses. "I've been alone for 3 years," Ruby continued, surprised by her own willingness to confide in this stranger. "This ranch, my late husband's business interests, the responsibility for dozens of employees, it's a lot for one person. The men who've been courting me seem more interested in what I own than who I am. And you figured a man who could understand a horse like Diablo might be more likely to understand you." Ruby felt heat rise in her cheeks. Put so plainly, her logic sounded either brilliant or completely foolish. Something like that. Eli nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense to me. Horse like that requires patience, respect, and the ability to see past surface behavior to what's really going on underneath. Those are good qualities in a partner too." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Ruby found herself studying Eli's hands, wrapped around his coffee mug-strong hands, with prominent veins and old scars, but gentle in their movements. There was something reassuring about his presence, a sense of calm competence that she hadn't felt around a man in years. "Mr. Boone," she said finally, "if you're serious about working with Diablo, you should know that the arrangement includes room and board for as long as it takes. I won't have you camping with the spectators and making a show of this." "Appreciate that, ma'am. Would prefer to keep things quiet anyway. And you should also know that if you're successful, if you do manage to gain Diablo's trust and partnership, I'll honor my commitment. The marriage offer is genuine." Eli met her gaze steadily. "And if I'm not successful, then you'll have given an honest effort, which is more than I can say for most of the others. That's worth something by itself." After Eli settled his mare in the barn and accepted Tom's offer of a room in the bunkhouse, Ruby watched him make his first approach to Diablo's corral. Unlike the previous challengers, he didn't stride forward with confidence or enter the enclosure immediately. Instead, he found a spot about 20 feet from the fence and simply sat down on an old wooden crate, positioning himself where Diablo could see him clearly. For the next hour, he remained motionless while the stallion paced and snorted and occasionally charged toward the fence. Eli showed no reaction to these displays, neither flinching from the mock attacks nor trying to calm the horse with gestures or words. He simply maintained his quiet presence, allowing Diablo to investigate this new element in his environment at his own pace. The small crowd of remaining spectators grew restless with the lack of action. Someone called out, asking when the real show would begin, but Eli ignored the comment completely. His attention remained focused on Diablo, studying the horse's movements and reactions with the concentration of a scholar reading an important text. As the afternoon wore on, Ruby found herself drawn back to the window repeatedly, fascinated by this different approach to her challenge. There was something almost meditative about Eli's patience, a quality that seemed to communicate itself to Diablo despite the distance between them. The stallion's pacing became less frantic, his attention more focused on the quiet man, who made no demands and issued no challenges. When darkness finally forced an end to the day's activities, Eli rose stiffly from his makeshift seat and walked back toward the bunkhouse without having spoken a word to the horse or taken a single step inside the corral. To the spectators, it might have looked like a day wasted, but Ruby sensed that something significant had begun, a conversation conducted in silence and patience rather than ropes and dominance. That night, as she prepared for bed, Ruby found herself thinking not about Diablo's training, but about Eli Boone himself. There was a story hidden in his weathered features and careful movements, a history that had taught him the value of patience and the cost of trust broken. Whatever that story was, she sensed it had prepared him for this challenge in ways that went far beyond simple horsemanship skills. The second day began much like the first, with Eli taking his position near Diablo's corral at dawn and settling into his patient vigil. Ruby watched from her kitchen window as he arranged himself on the wooden crate, noting how he'd brought a thermos of coffee and what looked like a piece of leather work to occupy his hands during the long hours of waiting. The remaining spectators had thinned considerably overnight. Word had spread that the new challenger wasn't providing much entertainment, and most of the thrill-seekers had departed for more promising diversions. Only a handful of genuinely curious onlookers remained, along with a few persistent suitors who seemed unwilling to abandon their hopes entirely. As Ruby carried her own coffee outside to tend to the morning chores, she found herself pausing near Eli's position. He looked up at her approach, touching the brim of his hat in greeting but not speaking. She noticed that Diablo, who had been standing at the far end of the corral, had moved closer to where Eli sat, though he maintained a cautious distance. "Progress?" she asked quietly. "Some," Eli replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's curious now instead of just defensive. That's the first step." Ruby followed his gaze to where Diablo stood, with his ears pricked forward, clearly listening to their conversation despite his apparent disinterest. The stallion's posture had indeed changed from the aggressive alertness of previous days to something more like watchful attention. "How can you tell the difference?" "Watch his eyes," Eli murmured. "Yesterday he was looking at me like a threat to be assessed. Today he's looking at me like a puzzle to be solved. Big difference in a horse's mind." Ruby studied Diablo's expression and realized Eli was right. There was an intelligence in the stallion's gaze that she hadn't noticed before, a thoughtful quality that suggested active consideration rather than simple wariness. As the morning progressed, she found herself making excuses to pass by the corral, ostensibly checking on other ranch activities but actually fascinated by the subtle drama playing out between man and horse. Eli had begun to move occasionally, not toward Diablo but simply shifting position or adjusting his hat, and each movement prompted a response from the stallion, a step closer or farther away, a change in ear position, a shift in weight that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read equine body language. At midday, when the sun was high enough to make sitting in one position uncomfortable, Eli rose and walked slowly away from the corral. Ruby expected Diablo to relax at his departure, but instead the horse moved to the fence line, following Eli's progress toward the barn until he disappeared from view. "Interesting," Tom Fletcher commented, appearing at Ruby's elbow as they both watched the stallion's behavior. "Horse is starting to miss him when he's gone." Ruby felt a flutter of hope that she'd been trying to suppress since Eli's arrival. "You think he might actually succeed?" Too early to tell, but this is the first time I've seen Diablo show interest in a human being instead of just hostility. Tom pushed his hat back and squinted toward the corral. That Boone fellow knows something about horses, that's certain. When Eli returned an hour later carrying what appeared to be a simple wooden chair, Ruby understood that his approach was evolving. He positioned the chair closer to the fence than his previous spot, but still well outside Diablo's striking range, and settled in for the afternoon session with the easy patience of a man accustomed to long waits. This time, however, he began to speak. His voice was so quiet that Ruby had to strain to hear it from her position near the barn, but she caught fragments of what sounded like a one-sided conversation about the weather, the countryside, and nothing in particular. Eli's tone was conversational rather than commanding, the kind of easy talk that might pass between old friends sharing a lazy afternoon. Diablo's response was immediate and striking. The stallion, who had maintained his distance all morning, began moving closer to the fence, his ears swiveling to catch every word. Within an hour, he was standing directly across from Eli, with only the fence rails between them, his head lowered in what could only be described as attentive listening. "Well, I'll be damned," breathed Pete Carlson, one of the few remaining challengers. "Look at that devil horse, acting like a trained dog." Ruby shot him a sharp look, irritated by the crude comparison. Diablo wasn't behaving like a trained animal, he was behaving like an intelligent creature who had found someone worth listening to. There was a dignity in his posture that spoke of choice rather than submission. As the afternoon wore on, Eli's quiet monologue continued, occasionally punctuated by long, comfortable silences. Ruby found herself drawn closer, curious about what he was saying to hold Diablo's attention so completely. "Worked a ranch up in Montana for a while," Eli was saying when she came within earshot. "Prettiest country you ever saw, especially in the autumn when the leaves turned. Had a horse there, a gray mare named Patience, smartest animal I ever knew. She could read weather better than any barometer, always knew when a storm was coming hours before the first clouds appeared." He was telling stories, Ruby realized, not trying to train or command or impose his will, but simply sharing pieces of his life with a horse who had clearly been starved for human companionship. It was an approach so fundamentally different from everything the previous challengers had attempted that she felt a surge of admiration for his insight. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and Eli prepared to end his second day of patient courtship, something remarkable happened. Diablo, who had been standing near the fence throughout the afternoon, extended his neck and gently touched his nose to the top fence rail, directly in line with where Eli sat. It was the first voluntary contact the stallion had made with anything connected to a human presence since his arrival at the ranch. The gesture was brief, lasting only seconds before Diablo pulled back to a safer distance, but its significance was unmistakable. Eli didn't react dramatically to the breakthrough. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a formal introduction, and continued his quiet conversation about mountain weather and the changing seasons. But Ruby, watching from 20 yards away, felt her heart race with the implications of what she'd just witnessed. After Eli left for the evening, Ruby remained by the corral, studying Diablo in the gathering twilight. The stallion seemed different, somehow less tense, more settled in his own skin. The wild fury that had characterized his previous interactions with humans had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment. "You like him, don't you?" she said softly to the horse. "After all those men trying to prove their strength, along comes someone who just wants to be your friend." Diablo turned at the sound of her voice, and for the first time since his arrival, he didn't pin his ears back or show signs of aggression. Instead, he regarded her with what seemed like calm interest, as if Eli's patient example had taught him to reconsider his assumptions about human intentions. On the third day, Eli brought a longer story, something about a cattle drive through Colorado and the various characters, both human and animal, he'd encountered along the way. Ruby found herself lingering near the corral longer than necessary, ostensibly checking fence repairs, but actually caught up in Eli's quiet tales of life on the trail. His stories had the feel of lived experience rather than borrowed adventure, filled with the kind of specific details that only came from direct participation. He spoke of night watches under star-filled skies, of rivers swollen with spring runoff, of the particular challenge of moving cattle through mountain passes where a single misstep could send an entire herd tumbling into disaster. But it was the personal touches that held Ruby's attention most strongly, his obvious affection for the animals in his care, his respect for the harsh beauty of the landscape, his appreciation for the simple pleasures of a job well done and a day honestly earned. These weren't the bragging tales of a man trying to impress an audience, but the reflections of someone who had found meaning in a life of quiet service. Diablo, for his part, seemed equally captivated. The stallion had taken to positioning himself as close to the fence as possible during Eli's visits, sometimes resting his chin on the top rail as if settling in for a long listen. His entire demeanor had transformed from the aggressive defensiveness of a trapped animal to the relaxed attention of a willing student. On the fourth day, something in Eli's saddlebag caught Ruby's attention as he arranged his daily setup. She glimpsed what looked like a faded photograph before he tucked it back inside, but not before she noticed his careful handling of the item, as if it held significant personal value. That afternoon, when Eli had been talking for over an hour about the different personalities of horses he'd known, Ruby approached close enough to join the conversation. "You've known a lot of horses in your time," she observed. Eli nodded, glancing up at her briefly before returning his attention to Diablo. "Enough to know they're all individuals. Each one has their own way of seeing the world, their own fears and preferences. Trick is figuring out how to speak their particular language." "And what language does Diablo speak?" "Still learning that," Eli admitted. "But I think he's a horse that's been disappointed before. Someone promised him partnership and delivered domination instead. That kind of betrayal runs deep in a smart animal." Ruby felt the comment resonate in her own chest. The parallel between Diablo's apparent history and her own experience with men who saw her wealth before they saw her was uncomfortably clear. How do you rebuild trust after it's been broken? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands still on his knees as he considered the question. "Same way you build it the first time, I suppose. One honest interaction at a time. No promises you can't keep, no demands you haven't earned the right to make." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Trust isn't something you can take or demand. It's something that gets offered when the other party decides you're worth the risk." As the fourth day ended and Eli prepared to leave, Diablo again made contact with the fence rail, this time holding the position for nearly a full minute. The stallion's eyes remained fixed on Eli's face during the entire exchange, as if memorizing every detail of the man who had shown him such unprecedented patience. That evening, Ruby found herself sitting on her porch long after sunset, thinking about trust and patience and the kind of courage it took to offer your heart to someone who might not prove worthy of the gift. In the distance, she could hear the gentle sounds of horses settling in for the night, and somehow the familiar music of her ranch seemed more peaceful than it had in years. Tomorrow would bring the fifth day of Eli's courtship of Diablo, and Ruby found herself genuinely curious about what new development might emerge from their growing partnership. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that whatever happened with the horse, Eli Boone had already succeeded in capturing something far more valuable: her respect, her interest, and the first fragile shoots of what might, with time and patience, grow into something deeper. Ruby found herself in the attic on the fifth morning of Eli's patient courtship of Diablo, ostensibly searching for a set of harness leather that Tom needed for repairs. But as dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight filtering through the small window, her attention was drawn to a trunk she hadn't opened since the month after Marcus's funeral. Inside, beneath carefully folded winter clothes and business papers, lay a pair of silver spurs that had belonged to her late husband, not the ornate ceremonial ones he'd worn for photographs and formal occasions, but the working spurs he'd used in his younger days when he still rode the range himself. Ruby lifted them from their resting place, feeling their familiar weight and remembering the sound they'd made on the kitchen floor when Marcus came in for breakfast during their early years together. She closed her eyes and let herself remember that version of her husband, lean and ambitious, his hands still bearing the calluses of honest labor, his dreams large but not yet hardened by success. He'd been different then, before wealth insulated him from the daily struggles that had shaped his character. The Marcus who had given her these spurs as a wedding gift had understood partnership in ways that the railroad baron he became had forgotten. A sound from outside drew her to the attic window, where she could see Eli beginning his daily ritual with Diablo. But today, something was different. The stallion was waiting at the fence when Eli arrived, positioned as close as possible to where the man typically sat. There was an eagerness in Diablo's posture that spoke of anticipation rather than mere tolerance. Ruby tucked the spurs into her apron pocket and made her way downstairs, drawn by curiosity about this new development in the relationship she'd been watching evolve over the past week. By the time she reached the corral, Eli had settled into his chair and begun what had become their daily conversation. "Morning, Diablo," Eli said in his quiet, conversational tone. "Looks like you're ready to start early today. That's good, means you're beginning to trust this old routine of ours." The stallion nickered softly in response, a sound Ruby had never heard him make before. It was a gentle, almost conversational noise that horses typically reserved for expressing contentment or greeting familiar companions. "You hear that?" Tom Fletcher appeared at Ruby's elbow, his voice filled with amazement. "That horse just talked back to him. I've been working with horses for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." Ruby nodded, equally fascinated by the transformation she was witnessing. Diablo had positioned himself so that his head was directly across from where Eli sat, separated only by the fence rails. The stallion's ears were pricked forward in an expression of attentive interest, and his entire body language suggested relaxed contentment. As the morning progressed, Eli began sharing what sounded like memories rather than the fictional stories he'd told in previous days. Ruby found herself drawn closer, no longer pretending to be occupied with other tasks, as she listened to his quiet recollections. "Had a commanding officer once," Eli was saying, his voice carrying a note of respect mixed with old sorrow. "Colonel Richardson, finest horseman I ever knew. He could take a green cavalry mount and turn it into a partner in ways that seemed almost magical. Used to say that breaking a horse was like breaking a man's spirit. It might get you temporary compliance, but it would never give you loyalty or courage when you needed it most." Ruby felt her breath catch. This was the first clear reference Eli had made to military service, and it explained much about his patient approach to difficult situations. Men who had served in the cavalry understood horses in ways that civilian ranchers often missed. They knew that in battle, a mount had to be more than obedient. It had to be willing to face danger alongside its rider. "The colonel taught us that partnership was built on respect rather than fear," Eli continued, his hand moving unconsciously to his left leg, where Ruby had noticed he favored an old injury. "Said a horse that trusted you would carry you through hell if necessary, while one that only feared you would dump you at the first sign of real trouble." Diablo moved closer to the fence, if such a thing were possible, his nose nearly touching the top rail. The stallion seemed as caught up in Eli's memories as Ruby was, responding to the emotional undertones in the man's quiet voice. "We had this one horse in the regiment, a big bay stallion named Thunder. Beautiful animal, but he'd been mishandled before the army got him. Took the colonel 6 months of patient work to gain that horse's trust. But once he did, Thunder became the finest cavalry mount in the regiment. Saved the colonel's life more than once, and probably mine too." Ruby found herself thinking about her own marriage and the parallel between Eli's stories and her relationship with Marcus. Her husband had been patient with her in their early years, taking time to earn her trust and affection rather than demanding it as his due. But success had changed him, made him assume that loyalty could be purchased rather than earned, that respect was something owed rather than offered freely. As she watched Eli continue his gentle conversation with Diablo, Ruby realized she was seeing a demonstration of the kind of partnership she'd once known and lost the slow, careful building of mutual trust that created bonds stronger than any rope or bridle. That afternoon, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Eli rose from his chair and approached the fence directly. Ruby held her breath, remembering the explosive violence that had greeted every other man who had dared to come within striking distance of the stallion. But Diablo didn't retreat or show aggression. Instead, he stood perfectly still as Eli reached the fence line, his ears forward and his expression alert but calm. The two regarded each other across the narrow space of the fence rails. Man and horse, separated by less than 3 feet, but connected by something that went deeper than physical proximity. "Hello, boy," Eli said softly, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he'd used from a distance. "Think you might be ready to let me get a little closer?" In response, Diablo extended his neck and touched his nose to Eli's outstretched hand through the fence rails. It was brief contact, lasting only seconds, but it represented a breakthrough that made Ruby's heart race with excitement. The remaining spectators, who had grown bored with days of seemingly uneventful conversation, suddenly perked up with interest. But Eli didn't capitalize on the moment or try to push for more dramatic progress. Instead, he simply acknowledged the gesture with a quiet, "Thank you," and stepped back to his chair, resuming his patient storytelling as if nothing momentous had occurred. But Ruby knew better. She had just witnessed the first real contact between Diablo and a human being since the stallion's arrival, and it had been offered freely rather than extracted through force. The implications of that gesture went far beyond simple horse training. It suggested that trust, once broken, could indeed be rebuilt through patience and consistency. That evening, as Ruby sat on her porch reviewing the day's events, she found herself thinking not just about Diablo's progress, but about her own growing feelings for the man who had made it possible. Eli Boone was unlike any of the men who had courted her since Marcus's death. He made no grand gestures or elaborate promises, didn't try to impress her with displays of wealth or strength. Instead, he demonstrated his character through quiet actions and consistent behavior, earning respect the same way he was earning Diablo's trust-stone, honest interaction at a time. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where she could see a familiar figure riding toward the ranch. Jake Morrison, the cattle buyer who had been one of Diablo's first failed challengers, was returning despite his humiliating defeat weeks earlier. Jake dismounted near the porch with his usual swagger, though Ruby noticed he kept glancing toward the corral where Diablo stood quietly in the gathering dusk. "Evening, Ruby. Heard tell that Drifter is still camping out here, trying to sweet-talk your demon horse." "Mr. Boone is my guest," Ruby replied coolly, irritated by Jake's dismissive tone, "and he's making more progress with Diablo than anyone else has managed." "Progress?" Jake laughed, but there was a bitter edge to the sound. "Sitting around talking to a horse isn't progress, it's foolishness. What you need is someone willing to show that animal who's boss, not coddle him like a pet." Ruby felt her temper rise at the criticism of Eli's methods. "And I suppose you think you're that someone?" "Matter of fact, I do. I've been thinking about that horse since I left here, and I've got some new ideas about how to handle him. All I need is another chance to prove myself." Before Ruby could respond, a quiet voice spoke from behind her. "Evening, folks. Hope I'm not interrupting anything." Eli had approached from the barn, moving with his characteristic measured pace. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation, though he showed no signs of hostility or territorial behavior toward Jake. Jake's reaction was less restrained. "So you're the horse whisperer everyone's talking about. Heard you've got some kind of magic touch with difficult animals." "Nothing magic about it," Eli replied mildly. "Just patience and respect. Most horses respond well to both." "Patience?" Jake's voice carried clear contempt. "That stallion needs firm handling, not bedtime stories. Horse like that has been running wild too long. He's forgotten what it means to respect human authority." Eli was quiet for a moment, studying Jake with the same careful attention he'd shown Diablo. "Respect isn't something you can force on an animal. he said finally. "It's something you earn through consistent, trustworthy behavior." That's pretty talk from someone who hasn't actually accomplished anything yet. When I was here before, that devil horse nearly killed me. You telling me he's just going to roll over and let you saddle him because you've been reading him fairy tales? Ruby found herself holding her breath, waiting to see how Eli would respond to the direct challenge. She'd grown protective of his methods and his gentle approach to what everyone else saw as a problem to be solved through force. "Diablo's been hurt before," Eli said, his voice remaining calm despite Jake's aggressive tone. "Someone he trusted broke faith with him, and now he's naturally suspicious of human intentions. But he's not mean-spirited, he's defensive. Big difference." Jake snorted in derision. "Defensive? Aggressive? What's the difference? Point is, he's dangerous and unmanageable." Ruby's challenge was supposed to find someone who could actually ride that horse, not someone who could bore him to sleep with campfire stories. The criticism of her challenge touched a nerve that Ruby hadn't realized was still sensitive. She'd been questioning the wisdom of her dramatic pronouncement for weeks, wondering if she'd created an impossible situation that could only end in disappointment. But Eli's steady presence and patient methods had given her hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found the right approach after all. The idea that Jake Morrison might somehow interfere with that progress filled her with protective anger. "Mr. Morrison," she said firmly, "I think it's time you left. Mr. Boone has my full support in his work with Diablo." Jake's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Your full support? Ruby, darling, you're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. This drifter is taking advantage of your soft heart, spinning this whole thing out to get free room and board while he fills your head with romantic notions about horse training." The accusation hit closer to home than Ruby cared to admit. Was she being foolish to trust Eli's methods? Was her growing attraction to him influencing her judgment about his abilities? But as she looked toward the corral where Diablo stood, watching their conversation with alert interest, rather than the aggressive suspicion he'd shown toward all previous visitors, Ruby knew that whatever else might be true, Eli's approach was working in ways that force and dominance never had. "Mr. Morrison," she said with quiet finality, "good evening." Jake mounted his horse with angry, jerky movements, his pride clearly wounded by the dismissal. "When this all falls apart, Ruby, don't say I didn't warn you. That horse is going to hurt someone, and that someone might be you." As Jake rode away into the gathering darkness, Ruby found herself alone on the porch with Eli. The evening air carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Thank you," Ruby said finally, "for not letting him provoke you into an argument." Eli nodded, his attention still focused on Diablo's corral. "Man like that sees every situation as a contest. Sometimes the best way to win is not to play." It was another glimpse into the philosophy that guided Eli's approach to both horses and people, and Ruby found herself increasingly impressed by his quiet wisdom. Here was a man who understood that strength could be demonstrated through restraint rather than aggression, that real confidence didn't require constant proof of dominance. As they stood together in the comfortable silence of the evening, Ruby felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the peaceful contentment of being with someone who didn't require her to be anything other than herself. The sixth day brought the most significant breakthrough yet. When Eli approached Diablo's corral that morning, he carried something Ruby hadn't seen before, a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork in the Native American style. The craftsmanship was exquisite, speaking of hands skilled in traditional arts and a culture that understood the deep connection between humans and horses. Ruby watched from her kitchen window as Eli settled into his usual position, but this time he placed the pouch on the ground beside his chair, where Diablo could see it clearly. The stallion's reaction was immediate and intense. His ears pricked forward with sharp attention, and he moved closer to the fence than he'd ever come before, stretching his neck toward the mysterious object as if drawn by some familiar scent or memory. "What's he got there?" Tom Fletcher asked, joining Ruby at the window with his own cup of coffee. I'm not sure, but Diablo certainly recognizes it. Ruby watched as the stallion continued to focus intently on the beaded pouch, his entire body language suggesting recognition rather than mere curiosity. As the morning progressed, Eli began what seemed like his most personal story yet, his voice carrying a note of deep respect mixed with old sadness. "I spent some time living with the Lakota people up in Dakota Territory," he began, his weathered hands resting gently on his knees as he spoke. "This was after my time in the cavalry, when I was trying to figure out what kind of life I wanted to build for myself. They took me in when I had nowhere else to go, taught me things about horses that the army never covered in all its training manuals." Ruby found herself drawn outside, abandoning any pretense of other activities as she moved closer to hear Eli's story. Diablo, too, seemed completely captivated, standing as near to the fence as possible, with his head lowered in an attitude of intense listening. "The Lakota have a different way of thinking about horses," Eli continued. "To them, a horse isn't something you own or control, it's a partner that chooses to share your journey. They believe that every horse has a spirit that must be honored, not broken. The relationship between rider and mount is sacred, built on mutual respect and understanding." The stallion nickered softly, and Ruby was startled to realize that the sound carried a different quality than she'd heard before, almost like recognition, as if Eli's words were awakening memories that had been buried beneath layers of mistrust and fear. "There was an old medicine man named White Bear who took a special interest in teaching me their ways with horses. He said that the white man's approach of breaking and dominating was like trying to capture the wind in a cage. You might contain it for a while, but you'd never truly possess its power." Eli reached down and touched the beaded pouch with reverent fingers. "White Bear gave me this medicine bag when I left the tribe. Said it contained herbs and prayers that would help me speak to any horse's spirit if I remembered to approach with humility instead of pride." Ruby felt her heart skip as she began to understand the significance of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just another training technique, it was a glimpse into a completely different philosophy of horsemanship, one that treated animals as spiritual beings, deserving of respect rather than objects to be conquered. Diablo had moved so close to the fence that his nose was pressed against the top rail, his nostrils flaring as he tried to catch the scent of the medicine pouch. His eyes were bright, with what Ruby could only describe as recognition, as if Eli's story had unlocked memories of a time when he had been treated with the kind of respect the Lakota showed their horses. "The thing about working with horses the Lakota way," Eli continued, his voice soft and conversational, "is that it requires you to set aside your ego and really listen to what the animal is trying to tell you. Every horse has their own story, their own fears and hopes and dreams. Your job as their partner is to understand that story and work within it, not try to rewrite it to suit your own purposes." As if in response to these words, Diablo did something that made Ruby's breath catch in her throat. The stallion extended his neck through the fence rails and gently touched his nose to Eli's shoulder knot, the brief, cautious contact he'd made in previous days, but a deliberate gesture of trust that lasted several long moments. Eli didn't move or speak during this contact, simply accepting the gift of trust with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the week. When Diablo finally pulled back, the man nodded once in acknowledgement, as if a formal agreement had just been reached between them. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered Tom Fletcher, his voice filled with awe. "That horse just claimed him. I've seen plenty of animals choose their people over the years, but never quite like that." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the transformation in Diablo's posture. The defensive tension that had characterized his every movement since his arrival had melted away, replaced by a relaxed confidence that spoke of a burden finally set down. Whatever trauma had driven the stallion to such extreme wariness seemed to be healing under the influence of Eli's patient, respectful approach. But the breakthrough also awakened something protective in Ruby that she hadn't expected. As word of Diablo's apparent taming spread through the remaining spectators, She could see the calculating looks in the eyes of men who viewed this development not as a beautiful example of interspecies communication, but as proof that the horse was finally ready to be claimed as a prize. Jake Morrison returned that afternoon, bringing two other men with him, professional bronc riders from the rodeo circuit who had heard about Ruby's challenge and thought they might succeed where others had failed. They approached the corral with the casual confidence of men accustomed to dominating difficult horses, completely missing the subtle nature of what had been accomplished between Eli and Diablo. "So this is the famous demon horse," said one of the newcomers, a barrel-chested man named Buck Hawkins. "Looks gentle as a lamb now. Guess all he needed was someone to show him who was boss." Ruby bristled at the misinterpretation of what she'd witnessed, but before she could respond, Diablo himself provided the correction. The stallion, who had been standing calmly near the fence where Eli sat, suddenly transformed back into the wild, defensive creature he'd been weeks earlier. His ears pinned back, his head came up in an aggressive arch, and he began pacing the corral with the restless energy of a caged predator. The change was so dramatic and immediate that even Buck took an involuntary step backward. "Well, hell," he muttered. "Maybe he's not as tame as he looked." "He's not tame," Eli said quietly, rising from his chair with careful movements that didn't further agitate the now upset stallion. "He's partnered. There's a difference." Jake snorted in derision. "Partnered? With a drifter who's been feeding him bedtime stories for a week? Ruby, you can't seriously believe this nonsense about horse spirits and Indian magic. This is a business transaction, not a romantic fairy tale." The criticism stung because it echoed Ruby's own occasional doubts about what she was doing. Was she being foolish to put stock in Eli's unconventional methods? Was her growing attraction to him clouding her judgment about his abilities? But as she watched Diablo's behavior, she realized something that the other men had missed entirely. The stallion wasn't showing generalized aggression. He was specifically reacting to the presence of men who approached him with dominance rather than respect. When Eli spoke softly and made no threatening movements, Diablo immediately began to calm, his ears coming forward and his pacing slowing to a more relaxed walk. "The horse knows the difference," Ruby said firmly, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "He can sense your intentions, and he doesn't like what he's sensing." Buck laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness in the sound. "Ma'am, with all due respect, horses don't read minds. They respond to strength and consistency, not to feelings and intentions." "This one does," Ruby replied, moving closer to the corral where Diablo had returned to his position near Eli's chair. The stallion's entire demeanor had shifted back to calm attention, as if the presence of the other men was merely a temporary distraction from more important matters. The contrast was so stark that even the most skeptical observer couldn't miss it. When Eli spoke to him, Diablo responded with interest and engagement. When the other men came near, he reverted to defensive wariness. The horse was making choices about whom to trust, and those choices were based on something more subtle than simple dominance or submission. As the afternoon wore on, the visiting bronc riders made increasingly aggressive suggestions about how to handle Diablo, each idea more focused on force and control than the last. Ruby found herself growing more protective of both the horse and the man who had shown such patience in winning his trust. "Gentlemen," she said finally, when Buck suggested using spurs and a quirt to remind the animal who was in charge, "I think it's time for you to leave. Mr. Boone has my complete confidence in his methods." Jake's face flushed with anger at the dismissal. "Ruby, you're making a mistake. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. That drifter has you so confused you can't see straight anymore." The accusation was too close to her own fears, and Ruby felt her temper flare in response. "My judgment is perfectly clear, Mr. Morrison. What's confusing me is why you keep coming back here after failing so spectacularly the first time." "Because I care about you," Jake exploded, his careful facade finally cracking. "Can't you see what's happening here? That smooth-talking cowboy has been filling your head with romantic nonsense about partnership and respect, but what he's really after is your money. He's running the longest con I've ever seen, and you're falling for it completely." The words hit Ruby like a physical blow, not because she believed them, but because they voiced the doubts that had been whispering in the back of her mind since Eli's arrival. Was she being naive to trust a man she'd known for less than a week? Was her loneliness making her vulnerable to manipulation? But as she looked toward the corral where Eli sat quietly beside Diablo, she saw something that dispelled her doubts completely. The two of them were positioned side by side, man and horse, both calm and comfortable in each other's presence. There was nothing calculated or manipulative in the scene, just genuine connection between two beings who had found something valuable in each other. "Mr. Morrison," Ruby said with quiet finality, "if you come back here again without an invitation, I'll have Tom escort you off the property. Good evening." As the frustrated suitors departed, Ruby found herself alone with Eli in the gathering twilight. Diablo had returned to his peaceful grazing, showing no signs of the agitation he'd displayed in the presence of the other men. "I'm sorry about that," Ruby said, feeling the need to apologize for the confrontation. Some people find it hard to accept that there might be a better way than force and dominance. Eli was quiet for a moment, studying the medicine pouch in his hands with thoughtful attention. White Bear used to say that fear makes people grab for control, but wisdom teaches you to let go and trust in partnership. The men who were here today, they're afraid of what they don't understand, so they try to control it. "And what about you?" Ruby asked, genuinely curious. "What are you afraid of?" Eli looked up at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his weathered features, a glimpse of the man behind the calm exterior. "Same thing as everyone else, I suppose. Being alone. Making mistakes that hurt people I care about. Not being worthy of the trust that's offered to me." The honesty of the answer touched something deep in Ruby's chest. Here was a man who understood that real strength came from acknowledging vulnerability, not from pretending it didn't exist. As they stood together in the comfortable silence that had become characteristic of their evening conversations, Ruby realized that her feelings for Eli had moved far beyond simple attraction or curiosity. She was falling in love with his gentle strength, his patient wisdom, and his respectful approach to both horses and people. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a sense of rightness she hadn't felt since the early days of her marriage to Marcus. This was what partnership was supposed to feel. Like not the constant negotiation of power and control, but the peaceful confidence that came from finding someone whose values and dreams aligned with your own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. There would be more skeptics to face, more people who questioned Eli's methods and her judgment in supporting them. But tonight, watching the man and horse who had chosen to trust each other despite their respective histories of betrayal, Ruby felt something she hadn't experienced in Yearshope, for a future built on love rather than loneliness. On the 7th morning, Ruby made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about Eli Boone. She had been looking for him to discuss arrangements for what seemed like the inevitable next step in his work with Diablo when she found his saddlebags had fallen open near the barn, their contents scattered by an overnight windstorm. Among the practical items, spare clothes, basic provisions, and grooming, supplies something gleamed in the morning sunlight. Ruby bent to gather the scattered belongings, intending to return them discreetly, but her breath caught as her fingers closed around a military medal. Not just any medal, but the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest honors the Army could bestow for extraordinary heroism in combat. The name engraved on the back made her hands tremble. Captain Elias J. Boone, 7th Cavalry Regiment, for gallantry in action against hostile forces. The date was 15 years old, from campaigns against renegade bands in the Montana Territory. Captain, not the humble drifter he'd presented himself as, but a decorated officer with the kind of military record that opened doors and commanded respect throughout the territory. Ruby's mind raced as she tried to reconcile this revelation with everything she'd observed about Eli's character and methods. She was still staring at the medal when footsteps approached behind her. Eli appeared around the corner of the barn, moving with his characteristic measured pace, but he stopped short when he saw what she held in her hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, The morning air seemed charged with tension as Ruby looked from the medal to the man who had been concealing such a significant part of his identity. "Captain Boone," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral, despite the turmoil of emotions churning in her chest. Eli's weathered face showed no surprise at being discovered, only a kind of resigned acceptance. "Ruby," he said quietly, "I can explain." "Can you?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, colored by a growing sense of betrayal that she struggled to understand. "Because right now, I'm wondering what else you've been hiding from me." Eli moved closer, his hands open and non-threatening, but Ruby took a step backward, needing space to process this revelation. The simple, honest cowboy she'd been falling in love with had just revealed himself to be something entirely different, a decorated war hero who had been concealing his true qualifications from the beginning. "You've known how to handle horses like Diablo all along," Ruby continued, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind. "All this talk about learning his language, about building trust gradually, you already knew exactly what you were dealing with, didn't you?" "Yes," Eli admitted, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "I recognized what kind of horse he was from the first day I saw him. Military mount, probably cavalry trained originally, then traumatized by rough handling after his service ended. I've seen it before." Ruby felt something cold settle in her stomach. So this entire week has been an act? All those patient conversations, the slow approach, the respect for his supposed wild nature, that was all calculated? No. The firmness in Eli's voice made her look up, meeting his steady gaze for the first time since her discovery. "The approach was genuine, Ruby. Everything I told you about patience and trust and partnership, that's all true. The only thing I concealed was my background." "Your background?" Ruby's voice rose with frustration and hurt. "Your background is the whole point. You're not some humble cowboy who happened to have a gift with difficult horses. You're a trained cavalry officer with years of experience handling military mounts. My challenge was supposed to test men's character, not their professional qualifications." Eli was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully before responding. "What would you have done if I'd introduced myself honestly? If I'd ridden in here and announced that I was Captain Boone, decorated cavalry officer with 15 years of experience training and retraining military horses?" Ruby opened her mouth to answer, then closed it as she realized the truth of what he was saying. She would have seen his credentials as an unfair advantage, would have questioned whether his success with Diablo was due to skill or character. The whole challenge would have seemed meaningless. But more than that, Eli continued, his voice growing quieter. "You would have looked at me the same way every other woman in my position has looked at me for the past 15 years, as a war hero, a symbol, a prize to be won, not as a man with his own fears and doubts and need for genuine connection." The words struck Ruby with unexpected force. She had created her challenge specifically to find a man who would see past her wealth to the woman beneath. And here was Eli confessing that he had concealed his own achievements for exactly the same reason, to be judged for who he was, rather than what he had accomplished. "So you lied to me," she said, but the accusation carried less heat than before. "I omitted information," Eli corrected gently. "Everything else I told you was true. My time with the Lakota, my beliefs about partnership and respect, my feelings about you, all of that was genuine." Ruby looked down at the medal in her hands, its weight seeming to increase as she held it. The inscription spoke of gallantry and heroism, but it also raised new questions about the man she thought she'd been getting to know. "What happened to end your military career?" she asked, gesturing toward the limp that had become more pronounced since he'd been spending long hours sitting beside Diablo's corral. Eli's face darkened, and for the first time since she'd known him, Ruby saw real pain flicker across his features. "Battle of Wolf Creek," he said simply. "Lost half my men and took a Sioux lance through the leg. Doctors said I'd never ride cavalry again, so the army pensioned me out. And then I spent a long time trying to figure out what kind of life a broken-down cavalry officer could build for himself. Tried ranching, tried business, tried drinking my way to the bottom of every bottle in Colorado. Nothing worked until I found my way to the Lakota camp and learned that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, it just means being different. Ruby felt her anger beginning to ebb, replaced by a growing understanding of the complexity of Eli's situation. Here was a man who had lost not just his career but his identity, forced to rebuild himself from the ground up after everything he'd believed about his purpose in life had been stripped away. "The challenge," she said slowly, working through the implications. "It wasn't fair, was it? You could have succeeded on the first day if you'd wanted to." "Probably," Eli admitted. "But that wasn't the point. The point was proving that I could be the kind of partner you deserved, not just the kind of horseman who could handle Diablo." Ruby looked toward the corral where the stallion stood, watching their conversation with alert interest. Even from this distance, she could see that Diablo's entire demeanor had changed since Eli's arrival. The defensive tension was gone, replaced by the relaxed confidence of an animal that knew it was safe and valued. "Did you plan this?" she asked. "Did you know about my challenge before you came here?" "I heard about it," Eli said honestly. "Word travels fast in ranch country, and a wealthy widow offering her hand to anyone who could handle a difficult horse, that kind of story gets attention. But I didn't come here planning to win you, Ruby. I came here hoping to find work and maybe prove to myself that I still had something to offer." "And when you saw Diablo?" "When I saw Diablo, I recognized a kindred spirit. A being that had been broken by betrayal and was trying to figure out how to trust again. I understood that horse because I was that horse, in my own way." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he was showing in admitting his own brokenness, touched something deep in Ruby's chest. She thought about her own journey since Marcus's death, her own struggle to rebuild trust after betrayal, and realized that perhaps Eli's deception had been born from the same fear that had driven her to create the challenge in the first place. "So what now?" she asked, the medal still warm in her palm. "Now that I know the truth about your qualifications?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Ruby and the corral where Diablo waited. "Now you decide whether what we've built together, you and me and Diablo, has been genuine despite the deception, or whether the lie makes everything else meaningless." Ruby closed her eyes, trying to sort through the conflicting emotions swirling in her chest. Part of her felt betrayed, deceived by a man she'd been falling in love with. But another part recognized the courage it had taken for Eli to approach her challenge with humility rather than arrogance, to prove his worth through character rather than credentials. "I need time to think," she said finally. Eli nodded, accepting her decision with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout their relationship. "I understand. I'll finish my work with Diablo. He deserves that much. But Ruby, whatever you decide about us, please know that my feelings for you have been honest from the beginning." As Eli walked away toward the corral where Diablo waited, Ruby remained standing near the barn, the military medal heavy in her hands. Everything she thought she knew about the challenge, about Eli, about her own judgment, had been turned upside down in the space of a single conversation. The revelation forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about her own motivations. Had she been attracted to Eli because of his humble circumstances, taking satisfaction in the idea of elevating a simple cowboy to her social position? Or had she genuinely fallen in love with his character, his values, his gentle strength? And what did it mean that he had succeeded with Diablo, not through superior character alone, but through professional expertise combined with personal insight? Did that invalidate everything they had accomplished together, or did it simply add another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation? As she watched Eli settle into his usual position beside Diablo's corral, the stallion immediately moving closer to greet him with obvious pleasure, Ruby realized that whatever else might be true, the connection between man and horse was undeniably genuine. Diablo's trust hadn't been won through deception or manipulation. It had been earned through consistent, respectful behavior that honored the animal's dignity and intelligence. The question that remained was whether the same could be said for the connection between herself and Eli. Had their growing relationship been built on mutual understanding and genuine affection, Or had it been compromised from the beginning by his concealment of his true identity? Standing in the morning sunlight, with a war hero's medal in her hands, Ruby faced the most difficult decision of her life. The challenge she had created to find a worthy partner had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. But now she had to decide whether the success had been achieved through honor or through the very kind of deception she had been trying to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to find a man who would see past her external circumstances to her true self, she had fallen for a man who had been concealing his own external circumstances all along. Whether that made them perfectly matched or completely incompatible remained to be seen. As the morning wore on and Ruby continued to grapple with her discovery, one thing became increasingly clear. The simple challenge she had issued weeks ago had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful than she had ever imagined. The question was no longer whether someone could tame Diablo, but whether two damaged souls could overcome their own fears and histories to build something genuine and lasting together. The medal in her hand seemed to pulse with the weight of that question, a tangible reminder that people were never quite what they appeared to be on the surface, and that real love required the courage to see and accept the whole truth, even when that truth was complicated and difficult to understand. Ruby spent the rest of that day avoiding both Eli and the corral, where he continued his work with Diablo. She found herself drawn instead to the small family cemetery on the hill behind the main house, where Marcus lay beneath a granite headstone that bore the simple inscription, "Beloved husband, visionary builder." The words had seemed appropriate 3 years ago, but now they struck her as somehow incomplete, lacking the personal touch that might have captured the complexity of the man she had married. Sitting on the stone bench that faced Marcus's grave, Ruby pulled her mother's locket from beneath her blouse, piece of jewelry she rarely wore but never removed, containing a faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day. Her mother had been 19 when the picture was taken, her father 22, both of them gazing at each other with the kind of uncomplicated devotion that seemed to belong to a simpler time. "What would you have done, Mama?" Ruby whispered to the photograph, tracing the worn gold surface with her thumb. "How do you know when someone's love is genuine if they've been hiding part of themselves from the very beginning?" Her parents had built their marriage on complete honesty, or so the family stories claimed. Her father had courted her mother for 2 years before proposing, laying out his modest prospects, his debts, and his dreams with the straightforward clarity of a man who understood that love without trust was no love at all. They had been poor but happy, struggling but united, until consumption took them both when Ruby was barely 17. The contrast with her own romantic history was stark. Marcus had courted her with grand gestures and expensive gifts, overwhelming her youthful inexperience with displays of wealth and ambition that had seemed like fairy tale romance. Only later had she learned that he'd been just as deceptive as Eli, concealing the ruthless methods he used to accumulate his fortune and the cold calculation that drove every relationship in his life. But there had been genuine love between them, at least in the beginning. Marcus had been capable of tenderness in their private moments, of vulnerability when his business pressures became too heavy to bear alone. The problem was that success had gradually eroded those softer qualities, replacing them with the harder edges of a man who had learned to see everything in terms of profit and loss. Now here was Eli, whose deception seemed motivated by the opposite impulse, not a desire to appear more successful than he was, but a need to be judged for his character rather than his achievements. The distinction mattered, but Ruby wasn't sure it mattered enough to overcome the fundamental breach of trust his concealment represented. As evening approached, she found herself drawn back toward the ranch buildings by the sound of voices raised in argument. A crowd had gathered near Diablo's corral, and Ruby could see the tension in their postures, even from a distance. Her heart sank as she realized that word of Eli's military background had somehow spread, bringing a new dimension of complexity to an already difficult situation. Jake Morrison was at the center of the group, his voice carrying clearly across the evening air as he held forth on the supposed injustice of the situation. "Told you all along that something wasn't right about that drifter. Turns out he's been lying to Ruby from the day he got here, hiding the fact that he's a trained cavalry officer with 15 years of experience handling military horses. That's not exactly lying, Tom Fletcher interjected, but his defense sounded half-hearted even to Ruby's ears. The hell it isn't, Jake shot back. The man presented himself as a simple cowboy looking for work, when all along he had the professional qualifications to handle a horse like Diablo. That's fraud, pure and simple. Buck Hawkins, the bronc rider who had been so spectacularly rejected by Diablo days earlier, nodded in angry agreement. Makes sense now why that horse took to him so quick. Wasn't character or patience or any of that mystical nonsense was professional expertise. Any of us could have done the same thing if we'd had military training. Ruby felt her temper rise at the gross oversimplification of what she'd witnessed between Eli and Diablo. The connection between man and horse had been about far more than technical knowledge. It had been a meeting of spirits, a recognition of shared experiences that went beyond anything that could be taught in a training manual. But even as she prepared to defend Eli's methods, doubt continued to gnaw at her. How much of what she'd interpreted as character and intuition had actually been the application of specialized skills? Had she been naive to see spiritual significance in what was essentially a professional doing his job? The point is, Jake continued, warming to his theme, Ruby's challenge was supposed to find a man worthy of marrying her, not a man with the right professional credentials. If technical expertise was all that mattered, she could have hired any cavalry sergeant and saved herself weeks of trouble. The comment struck at the heart of Ruby's own confusion. Her challenge had been designed to reveal character, to find a man who could see past surface appearances to deeper truths. But Eli's deception suggested that he had been manipulating appearances from the beginning, presenting himself as something he wasn't in order to influence her judgment. As she approached the group, Ruby caught sight of Eli standing slightly apart from the main crowd, his face composed but his posture tense. Diablo stood near the fence behind him, the stallion's ears pinned back in response to the aggressive voices and hostile energy radiating from the assembled men. "Mrs. Langston," Buck Hawkins called out as he noticed her approach, "we've been discussing this situation with your so-called challenge. Seems to me that if the contest was about finding the best horseman, then it ought to be reopened now that we know the truth about Boone's background." "The contest was never about finding the best horseman," Ruby replied, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "It was about finding someone who could work with Diablo using respect rather than force." "And you think deception and fraud show respect?" Jake demanded. "Ruby, darling, you've been played by a professional con artist. This man has been lying to you from the moment he arrived, presenting himself as something he's not in order to win your sympathy and your challenge." The accusation hit home because it echoed Ruby's own fears, but it also sparked a protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever else Eli might have concealed, his treatment of both herself and Diablo had been consistently respectful and patient. "Mr. Boone's methods with Diablo have been exemplary," she said firmly. "Whatever questions I might have about his background, I have no complaints about his character." "Character?" Jake laughed harshly. "Ruby, the man has been lying to you for over a week. If that doesn't tell you something about his character, then you're even more blinded by sentiment than I thought." The personal attack pushed Ruby past her breaking point. "Mr. Morrison, I've had quite enough of your opinions on this matter. Since you've never demonstrated any ability to work with difficult horses yourself, I don't see why your judgment should carry any weight." "Because I'm honest about who I am," Jake shot back. "I don't sneak around pretending to be a simple cowboy when I'm really a decorated war hero. I don't manipulate women's emotions by playing on their sympathy for humble working men." The words stung because they contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. Ruby had been attracted to what she'd perceived as Eli's humble circumstances, taking satisfaction in the idea that she could judge a man's worth without being influenced by external achievements. The discovery that those circumstances had been at least partially manufactured forced her to question her own motivations and judgment. But as she looked toward Eli, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, Ruby saw something in his weathered features that gave her pause. There was pain there, yes, and resignation, but also a kind of dignity that spoke of a man who understood that his actions would be judged fairly or unfairly, regardless of his ability to defend them. "This whole situation is ridiculous," Buck Hawkins declared, apparently emboldened by Jake's attack. "The challenge should be voided because of Boone's deception, and those of us who were eliminated unfairly should get another chance to prove ourselves." "With what?" Ruby asked, gesturing toward Diablo's corral. "The horse who threw you into the fence so hard you couldn't walk straight for an hour? The same horse who's now calm and responsive because someone finally took the time to understand what he needed." "That's just professional technique," Buck insisted. "Any of us could have done the same thing if we'd known the horse was military trained." Ruby looked at the assembled men, Jake with his swagger and sense of entitlement, Buck with his crude assumptions about dominance and control. The others, with their mixture of greed and wounded pride, and realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. "No," she said quietly, "you couldn't have. Because it wasn't about knowing Diablo's background. It was about seeing him as an individual deserving of respect rather than an obstacle to be overcome." She turned toward Eli, who was watching the confrontation with the same patient attention he'd shown throughout their relationship. "Mr. Boone, would you mind joining me? I think it's time we settled this matter once and for all." Eli approached with his characteristic measured pace, seemingly unaffected by the hostile energy radiating from the other men. When he reached Ruby's side, she felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her, as if his presence brought order to the chaos of her emotions. "Gentlemen," Ruby said, addressing the assembled crowd, "you're absolutely right that Mr. Boone's background changes the nature of what we've accomplished here. A trained cavalry officer working with a military horse is indeed a different situation than a simple cowboy gentling a wild Mustang." She paused, letting the admission sink in before continuing. "But you're wrong about what that means. The revelation doesn't invalidate what Mr. Boone has achieved, it makes it more remarkable." Jake started to protest, but Ruby held up a hand to silence him. A professional horseman could have forced Diablo into submission using standard cavalry techniques. Instead, Mr. Boone chose to approach him with the patience and respect due to a traumatized animal, rebuilding trust slowly rather than imposing his will through superior knowledge and skill. She looked directly at Eli as she spoke, seeing something shift in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude for her understanding of what he had actually accomplished. "That choice," Ruby continued, "tells me more about his character than any credential or achievement possibly could. It tells me that he's the kind of man who uses his strength to protect rather than to dominate, who sees his expertise as a responsibility rather than a weapon." The silence that followed her words was broken by Diablo himself, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the confrontation. The stallion moved to the fence line and nickered softly, his attention focused on Eli with obvious concern for the man who had become his partner. The simple gesture spoke volumes about what had been built between them, not the forced obedience of a broken animal, but the voluntary cooperation of a being that had chosen to trust again. It was a relationship that transcended professional technique, grounded in mutual respect and genuine affection. "The challenge stands, as originally stated," Ruby announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a final decision. "Mr. Boone has demonstrated exactly the qualities I was looking for, and I'm prepared to honor my commitment." Jake's face flushed red with anger and disbelief. "Ruby, you can't be serious. This whole thing has been a sham from the beginning." "No," Ruby replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "This whole thing has been exactly what it was supposed to be, test of character rather than skill. Mr. Boone passed that test, not because of his military background, but despite it." She turned to face Eli directly, seeing her own emotions reflected in his steady gaze. "The question now is whether he's willing to accept the prize, knowing that it comes with a woman who's been just as deceptive about her own motivations as he was about his background." Eli's weathered face showed surprise at the admission, but also something that looked like relief. "Ruby, he said softly. "I think we both know that love built on perfect honesty is rare as hen's teeth. The question is whether we're willing to build something better on the foundation of what we've learned about each other." As the sun set behind the mountains and the crowd of disappointed suitors began to disperse, Ruby felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage. To Marcus, the peaceful confidence that came from finding someone whose values aligned with her own, whose strength complemented rather than competed with hers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about how to blend their lives and histories into something sustainable and genuine. But tonight, standing beside the man who had shown her the difference between conquering and partnering, Ruby felt ready to face whatever came next. The morning of the 8th day dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. Ruby stood at her kitchen window, watching as Eli approached Diablo's corral with something she had never seen him carry before, a simple rope halter, hand-braided from what looked like the softest leather she had ever seen. The halter was beautiful in its simplicity, free of the metal fittings and harsh edges that characterized most horse tack. Every inch of it spoke of careful craftsmanship and deep respect for the animal that would wear it. This wasn't equipment designed to control or dominate, it was an invitation to partnership, tangible evidence of trust offered and hopefully received. Tom Fletcher appeared at Ruby's elbow, his own coffee cup in hand, as he observed the scene developing outside. "That's some fine leatherwork," he commented quietly. "Haven't seen craftsmanship like that since my grandfather's time. Man who made that halter understands horses right down to his bones." Ruby nodded, her throat tight with emotion, as she watched Eli settle into his usual position beside the corral. Diablo was waiting for him, positioned as close to the fence as possible, his ears pricked forward with the kind of eager attention that spoke of genuine anticipation rather than mere tolerance. "You think he can do it?" Ruby asked, though she wasn't entirely sure what "it" meant anymore. The challenge had evolved far beyond the simple matter of breaking a difficult horse. It had become a test of whether trust, once broken, could be rebuilt through patience and consistent behavior. "If anyone can, it's him," Tom replied. "That horse would follow Boone anywhere by now. Question is whether the animal's ready to let a human guide him again, or whether the old fears are still too strong." As they watched, Eli began speaking to Diablo in the quiet, conversational tone that had become his trademark over the past week. Ruby couldn't make out all the words from her position at the window, but the cadence was familiar, respectful, unhurried, filled with the kind of genuine affection that couldn't be faked. "Today's the day, isn't it, boy?" Eli was saying, his weathered hands resting gently on the top fence rail. "Time to find out whether all this talking has meant anything, or whether we're still just strangers sharing the same space." Diablo nickered softly in response, a sound that had become increasingly common over the past few days. The stallion's entire demeanor had transformed since Eli's arrival, the defensive tension replaced by relaxed confidence, the wild unpredictability giving way to thoughtful attention. But this moment would be different from all the others. This was the first time Eli would ask Diablo to accept physical constraint, to trust not just in his presence but in his guidance. For a horse that had clearly been betrayed by human authority before, it represented a leap of faith that went to the very core of his being. Ruby found herself holding her breath as Eli slowly reached through the fence rails with the halter, moving with the deliberate care of a man who understood exactly how significant this moment was. Diablo's eyes followed every movement, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the soft leather. "This belonged to Thunder," Eli explained quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Remember me telling you about him? The big bay stallion who served with Colonel Richardson? Thunder wore this halter for over 5 years, and it never chafed him, never caused him pain. He trusted it because he trusted the man who put it on him." The historical connection seemed to resonate with Diablo in ways that went beyond mere words. The stallion moved closer to the fence, his muzzle nearly touching the leather as he investigated this new element in their relationship. "I'm hoping you might be willing to try it on," Eli continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the weight of the moment. "Not because I want to control you, but because I'd like to show everyone else what I already know, that you're not a wild animal to be conquered, but a partner willing to cooperate with someone who treats you with respect." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes as she watched this gentle courtship between man and horse. There was something profoundly moving about Eli's approach, the way he explained his actions, asked for permission rather than demanding compliance, treated Diablo as an intelligent being capable of making choices about his own life. The stallion studied the halter for long minutes, his ears swiveling back and forth as he processed this development. Ruby could almost see the internal debate playing out, the desire to trust warring with memories of past betrayals, hope struggling against the safety of maintaining distance. Finally, with a decision that seemed to surprise even himself, Diablo extended his neck and gently touched his nose to the halter. It was the same gesture he had made when first greeting Eli's hand, but this time it carried even greater significance. He wasn't just acknowledging Eli's presence, he was indicating his willingness to accept the partnership that the halter represented. Eli's response was perfect in its restraint. He didn't immediately try to slip the halter over Diablo's head or rush to capitalize on the moment of trust. Instead, he simply held the leather steady, allowing the horse to investigate it thoroughly, to become familiar with its texture and scent. "That's it," he murmured encouragingly. "Take all the time you need. This is your choice, not mine." The distinction mattered more than Ruby had initially understood. Most horse training involved the gradual removal of the animal's choices, the systematic elimination of options until compliance became the path of least resistance. But Eli's approach was fundamentally different. He was expanding Diablo's choices, offering new possibilities for cooperation and partnership. As the morning progressed, Ruby found herself drawn outside, unable to remain a passive observer of such a significant moment. She positioned herself where she could see clearly, but remained far enough away to avoid disrupting the delicate dynamic between man and horse. Other members of the ranch staff had noticed the morning's activities and were gathering at respectful distances, their usual chores forgotten in favor of witnessing what promised to be either a triumphant breakthrough or a devastating setback. Even the horses in nearby corrals seemed to sense that something important was happening. They stood alert at their fence lines, watching the proceedings with the kind of focused attention that animals reserved for moments of genuine significance. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured as Diablo showed signs of nervousness at the growing audience. "Just you and me, same as always. These folks are here because they care about you, not because they want to see you fail." The reassurance seemed to work. Diablo's attention returned to Eli and the halter, his breathing settling into the relaxed rhythm that indicated genuine calm rather than forced submission. Then, in a moment that would be talked about around ranch country for years to come, Diablo made his choice. The stallion lowered his great head and gently pushed his nose forward, clearly inviting Eli to place the halter where it belonged. The gesture was so deliberate, so obviously voluntary, that even the most skeptical observer couldn't mistake it for anything other than willing cooperation. This wasn't a horse being broken or dominated. This was a partner offering his trust to someone who had proven worthy of receiving it. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he carefully lifted the halter over Diablo's ears, his movements slow and reverent, as if he were handling something precious beyond measure. The leather settled into place with perfect fit, the craftsmanship evident in how naturally it conformed to the stallion's head. "There," Eli said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "How does that feel?" Diablo tossed his head experimentally, testing the weight and feel of the halter, then stood perfectly still as understanding dawned in his intelligent eyes. The leather was so soft, so perfectly fitted, that it felt like nothing more than a gentle reminder of the partnership he had chosen to accept. Ruby felt her own eyes fill with tears as she watched this moment of mutual trust unfold before her. Here was everything she had hoped her challenge might accomplish. Not the breaking of a wild spirit, but the healing of a wounded one. Not the domination of the strong over the weak, but the joining of two beings who recognize something valuable in each other. The crowd of onlookers seemed to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. Instead of cheers or applause, a respectful silence fell over the gathering as Diablo took his first steps wearing the halter, his movements confident and unafraid. Tom Fletcher approached Ruby's position, his weathered face creased with admiration. "In 30 years of working with horses, I've never seen anything quite like that," he said quietly. "That animal didn't just accept the halter, he asked for it. That's the difference between partnership and domination right there." Ruby nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. She was watching more than successful horse training. She was witnessing a demonstration of what was possible when trust was rebuilt through patience and respect, rather than enforced through fear and control. As Eli prepared for the next phase of this momentous day, Ruby realized that her feelings about the situation had clarified completely. Whatever deceptions and concealed truths had complicated their relationship, what she was seeing now was absolutely genuine. Man using his skills not to exploit or dominate, but to heal and restore. This was the character she had been looking for all along, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. With Diablo wearing the halter and standing calm and confident beside the fence, Eli knew that the moment of ultimate trust was approaching. Everything that had been built over the past week of quiet conversation, every patient gesture, every demonstration of respect and understanding had led to this point where he would ask the stallion to accept not just guidance, but a human presence on his back. Ruby watched from her position near the barn as Eli opened the corral gate for the first time since his arrival. The simple action carried enormous symbolic weight after days of working through fence rails, maintaining the barrier that ensured Diablo's sense of safety. Eli was now proposing to enter the horse's space as an equal partner rather than a potential threat. Diablo's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of backing away from the open gate or showing signs of alarm, the stallion stepped forward to meet Eli at the threshold, his head lowered in a gesture of respect and welcome. The sight of the two of them standing together in the gateway, separated by nothing but mutual trust, brought fresh tears to Ruby's eyes. "Hello, partner," Eli said quietly, running his hand along Diablo's neck with the easy familiarity of long friendship. "Ready to show these folks what we've accomplished together?" The stallion's response was to nicker softly and lean into the touch, behavior that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. The transformation was so complete, so obviously genuine, that even the most skeptical observer could see that something extraordinary had occurred. Tom Fletcher stepped forward with a saddle blanket and the lightest saddle he could find in the tack, room knot, the heavy cavalry gear that might have been more appropriate to Diablo's apparent background, but a simple working saddle that spoke of partnership rather than dominance. "Will he accept tack?" Tom asked quietly, understanding the significance of this next step. "We'll ask him," Eli replied, taking the blanket and approaching Diablo with the same careful respect he'd shown throughout their relationship. "What do you say, boy? Think you might be willing to carry me around for a bit?" The question was more than rhetorical. Courtesy Eli genuinely seemed to be waiting for Diablo's consent before proceeding. The stallion studied the saddle blanket for several moments, his nostrils flaring as he processed this new element in their partnership. Then, in a gesture that brought gasps from the watching crowd, Diablo lowered his head and gently nuzzled the blanket, giving what could only be interpreted as his approval for the next stage of their cooperation. Eli placed the blanket on Diablo's back, with movements so slow and careful they resembled a religious ritual. Every action was telegraphed in advance, every touch preceded by quiet words of explanation and reassurance. The stallion stood perfectly still throughout the process, his attention focused on Eli's face rather than the unfamiliar equipment. The saddle followed the same pattern offered for inspection, accepted through deliberate choice rather than passive submission, positioned with the kind of care usually reserved for handling precious and fragile objects. When the cinch needed to be tightened, Eli explained each adjustment, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a professional horseman, tempered by the sensitivity of someone who understood exactly how significant this moment was for his partner. "Look at that," Martha Henderson whispered to Ruby, having arrived from town just in time to witness the climactic moments. "That horse is helping him get ready. I've never seen anything like it." Ruby nodded, equally amazed by what she was observing. Diablo was indeed participating actively in the saddling process, shifting his weight to make the adjustments easier, holding perfectly still when steadiness was required, even seeming to anticipate what would be needed next. When the tack was in place and properly adjusted, Eli stepped back to survey his work. The stallion looked magnificent in the simple bravery line of his powerful body, speaking of contained energy and willing cooperation. This wasn't the broken submission of a conquered animal, but the confident readiness of a partner prepared to share a new adventure. "You ready for this?" Eli asked, his hand resting gently on Diablo's shoulder. The horse's answer was to step closer to Eli and lower his head, the gesture unmistakably inviting the man to mount. It was an invitation offered freely, without coercion or force, the culmination of everything they had built together over the past week. Ruby held her breath as Eli gathered the reins and prepared to swing into the saddle. This was the moment that would prove whether all the patient work, all the quiet conversations, all the gentle persistence had truly created the partnership it appeared to represent. As Eli settled into the saddle, Diablo's ears remained forward, his body relaxed and responsive. There was no bucking, no fighting, no attempt to dislodge his rider, just the calm acceptance of a horse who had chosen to trust and found that trust honored rather than betrayed. "Walk on," Eli said softly, his voice carrying the same conversational tone that had characterized their entire relationship. Diablo stepped forward with fluid grace, his movements confident and controlled. Horse and rider moved together with the kind of harmony that usually took months or years to develop, each seeming to anticipate the other's needs and intentions. As they completed their first circuit of the corral, Ruby felt a profound sense of completion settle over her. This was what her challenge had been meant to discover, not just someone who could dominate a difficult horse, but someone who could create genuine partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. The watching crowd seemed to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. Instead of the cheers and applause that might have greeted a typical bronc riding exhibition, a respectful silence pervaded the gathering. This wasn't entertainment, this was something approaching the sacred, a demonstration of what was possible when strength was tempered by wisdom and power, guided by compassion. After several more circuits of the corral, Eli brought Diablo to a stop in front of where Ruby stood. Both horse and rider looked completely at ease, their partnership so natural and comfortable that it seemed as if they had been working together for years rather than days. "Well," Eli said with quiet satisfaction, "I guess we've answered your challenge, Mrs. Langston." Ruby felt her heart swell with emotion as she looked at the two of them, the man who had shown such patience and wisdom, the horse who had found the courage to trust again. But the moment also brought a sudden realization that made her catch her breath. "Actually," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I think I need to amend the terms of the challenge." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd, and she saw uncertainty flicker across Eli's weathered features. He dismounted and approached the fence, leading Diablo beside him, both of them waiting for her to explain this unexpected development. Ruby reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small object that caught the morning sunlight, simple gold ring that she had been carrying since the previous evening. Not her elaborate wedding set from Marcus, but a plain band that she had purchased in town the day before, chosen for its simplicity and honest craftsmanship. "You've proven that you can work with Diablo using respect and partnership," she said, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to voice what her heart had been telling her for days. But the challenge was never really about the horse, was it? It was about finding someone who understood that real partnership requires choice on both sides. Eli's eyes widened as he began to understand what she was saying. "So, I'm changing the challenge," Ruby continued, stepping closer to the fence that separated them. "Instead of asking you to win me as a prize for succeeding with Diablo, I'm asking if you'd be willing to accept me as a partner. Not because you've earned me through demonstration of skill, but because we've found something worth building together." The distinction was crucial, transforming the dynamic from one of conquest and reward to one of mutual choice and genuine commitment. Ruby held out the simple ring, her hand trembling slightly with the vulnerability of the moment. "Eli Boone," she said formally, "will you marry me?" The crowd fell silent as everyone waited for his response. Even Diablo seemed to understand the importance of the moment, standing perfectly still beside his partner, as if reluctant to disturb the delicate balance of hopes and fears hanging in the morning air. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face working through emotions too complex for easy expression. When he finally spoke, his voice carried all the honesty and straightforward simplicity that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Ruby Langston," he said, reaching through the fence rails to take the ring from her trembling fingers, "I'd be honored to be your partner in whatever adventures life might bring us." As he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger through the fence rails, Ruby felt something settle in her chest that had been restless and searching for years. This wasn't the grand romantic gesture of her youth or the calculated courtship of her first marriage. This was something deeper and more genuine, built on mutual understanding and shared values rather than passion or ambition. The crowd finally found its voice, erupting in cheers and applause as Tom Fletcher opened the corral gate to allow the newly engaged couple to embrace properly. But Ruby's attention was focused entirely on the man who had just accepted her proposal and the horse who had made their meeting possible. As Eli held her close, Diablo stepped forward and gently nuzzled both of them, as if offering his own blessing on the partnership that had grown out of his willingness to trust again. The three of them stood together in the morning sunlight, woman, man, and horse each, having found something precious that they had feared was lost forever. The simple ring on Ruby's finger caught the light as she reached up to touch Eli's weathered cheek, and she knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together as true partners, bound not by conquest or obligation, but by the rarest and most valuable of all human emotions, love freely given and gratefully received. 6 months after the morning when Eli had first ridden Diablo, Ruby stood before the carved wooden sign that now marked the entrance to their property. The letters, carved in Eli's careful hand, read, "The Boone Langston Ranch," in simple, elegant script that spoke of permanence and partnership. Below the main text, in smaller letters, were the words, "Established 1884, where trust is earned, not taken." The sign had been Eli's wedding gift to her, crafted during the long winter evenings when the demands of ranch work gave way to the quieter pursuits of planning and building their shared future. Like everything else he touched, it bore the mark of careful craftsmanship and thoughtful intention, beautiful in its simplicity, meaningful in its message. Their wedding had taken place on a crisp October morning, with Diablo serving as an honored witness to the ceremony that united not just two people, but two ways of life. The stallion had stood quietly beside the makeshift altar in the ranch's main pasture, decorated with ribbons that fluttered in the autumn breeze, and seeming to understand the significance of the occasion. Martha Henderson had served as Ruby's matron of honor, while Tom Fletcher had stood beside Eli as his best man. The guest list had been deliberately small ranch hands, townspeople, and the few neighbors who had come to understand that what they were witnessing was something special and rare. Even Jake Morrison had attended, his earlier hostility replaced by grudging respect for what Eli and Ruby had accomplished together. The ceremony itself had been simple and heartfelt, with vows they had written themselves that spoke of partnership rather than possession, of mutual support rather than traditional roles. When the preacher had pronounced them husband and wife, Diablo had whinnied his approval, bringing laughter and tears from the assembled guests. Now, as spring returned to the valley and Ruby felt the first stirrings of new life within her own body, She reflected on how much had changed since that day when she had issued her desperate challenge to a saloon full of ambitious men. The woman who had stood before that crowd, lonely and defensive, seeking someone who could see past her wealth to her true worth, seemed like a distant memory. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Merging two strong personalities, each accustomed to making independent decisions, had required patience and compromise from both partners. There had been disagreements about ranch management, about money, about the dozens of daily decisions that shaped their shared life. But through it all, they had maintained the respectful communication that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Eli had proven to be everything Ruby had hoped for in a partner, and more than she had dared to dream. His military background had indeed proven valuable in managing the ranch's operations, but it was his character that had made their marriage a success. He treated her as an equal partner in all decisions, valued her opinions and experience, and never made her feel that her wealth was more important to him than her companionship. The ranch itself had flourished under their joint management. Eli's expertise with horses had transformed their breeding program, while Ruby's business acumen had expanded their markets and improved their profitability. They had become known throughout the territory not just for the quality of their stock, but for their innovative approaches to horse training that emphasized partnership over dominance. Diablo had become something of a legend in his own right. The stallion, who had once been too dangerous to approach, was now the cornerstone of their breeding program, siring foals that inherited both his impressive physical traits and his intelligent, cooperative temperament. More importantly, he served as living proof that damaged trust could be rebuilt through patience and consistent behavior. The horse had also become Ruby's personal mount, a development that had surprised everyone, including herself. The bond between them had grown gradually, built on the foundation of mutual respect that Eli had established. Riding Diablo had become one of Ruby's greatest pleasures, a daily reminder of what was possible when strength was guided by wisdom. As she stood by the ranch sign on this particular morning, Ruby was waiting for Eli to return from town, where he had gone to collect supplies and mail. She could see him approaching in the distance, his familiar figure mounted on his bay mare, with Diablo running free beside them, the stallion's lead rope looped casually over the saddle horn. The sight never failed to move her the easy partnership between her husband and the horse that had brought them together. The natural grace with which they moved across the landscape they all called home. Diablo could have been ridden, but he often chose to run alongside Eli's mount, seeming to prefer the freedom to move at his own pace while maintaining his connection to his human partner. When the trio reached the ranch gate, Eli dismounted and opened it with the efficient movements of long practice, allowing both horses to pass through before closing it behind them. Diablo immediately approached Ruby for his customary greeting, a gentle nuzzle that had become their daily ritual. "How was town?" Ruby asked, as Eli kissed her cheek, his familiar presence bringing the sense of completeness that had become the foundation of her daily contentment. "Productive," he replied, helping her sort through the packages and letters he had collected. Tom's order came in, and Martha sent along some of her apple butter. "Oh, and there's a letter from that horse breeder in Colorado who's been asking about one of Diablo's colts." They walked together toward the house, their conversation meandering through the comfortable topics of shared daily life plans for the coming season, news from neighbors, small decisions that shaped their world. It was the kind of ordinary conversation that Ruby had once thought she would never have again, the simple pleasure of sharing life's details with someone who cared about both her thoughts and her well-being. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Ruby found herself thinking about the challenge that had changed her life so dramatically. What had begun as a desperate attempt to find companionship had become something far more meaningful, a demonstration that love could be built on respect and understanding rather than passion or ambition. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Eli, her hand resting gently on the slight swell of her belly where their first child was growing. "Regret what?" "Coming here, taking on my challenge. All of it could have gone so differently." Eli was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the gathering twilight. "I regret that I wasn't more honest with you from the beginning about my background. I regret that my concealment caused you pain and doubt, but regret coming here, regret finding you and Diablo." He shook his head. "Never. This is the life I always wanted but never thought I deserved." Ruby leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the peaceful contentment that had become her daily reality. "I used to think that second chances were rare," she said. "Now I think they're everywhere, waiting for people brave enough to recognize them and wise enough to act on them." As if summoned by their conversation, Diablo approached the porch from the pasture where he had been grazing, his hoofbeats soft on the evening grass. The stallion had developed the habit of checking on them each evening, as if his protective instincts extended to the humans who had shown him such patience and respect. "Evening, partner," Eli said softly, rising to greet the horse that had made their meeting possible. "Everything peaceful out there?" Diablo nickered in response, allowing Eli to run his hands along the powerful neck that had once been too dangerous for human touch. The transformation was complete, not the broken submission of a conquered animal, but the willing cooperation of a being that had learned to trust again. As the three of them stood together in the evening, stillness woman, man, and horse, Ruby felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding that some stories, despite their complicated beginnings, were meant to have happy endings. The challenge she had issued in desperation had led to discoveries about love, trust, and partnership that would shape the rest of their lives. The carved wooden sign at the ranch entrance bore witness to their journey, a testament to the truth that trust, once earned, could create bonds stronger than any rope or contract. And in the growing dusk of another day in their shared life, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of their story were yet to be written. The ranch settled into evening quiet around them, horses moving peacefully in the pastures, the familiar sounds of home creating a symphony of contentment that spoke to Ruby's deepest longings finally fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to demonstrate that love built on mutual respect could weather any storm. But tonight, surrounded by the tangible evidence of what they had built together, the thriving ranch, the peaceful animals, the promise of new life, Ruby felt the profound gratitude that came from recognizing that sometimes, when you were brave enough to take a chance on trust, the universe responded by giving you everything you had ever dared to hope for, and more than you had ever dreamed possible. The simple gold ring on her finger caught the last light of the setting sun as she reached for Eli's hand, and in that gentle touch was all the promise of their shared future, a future built not on conquest or possession, but on the rarest and most precious foundation of all: love, freely given and gratefully received, trust earned through consistent action, and partnership chosen daily through countless small acts of respect and understanding. In the distance, other horses called softly to each other across the peaceful pastures, their voices joining in the evening chorus that spoke of safety, security, and the deep contentment that came from finding one's proper place in the world. And Ruby knew, with the certainty that came from having traveled the long journey from loneliness to love, that she was finally, completely, and eternally home.